If you would like to talk to him and get one of his fine books, he's going to be out there in the lobby signing books, giving you books, selling you books, and serving your every Cyril Wecht book need right after the show. So please go say hello to the good doctor afterwards. I don't know about you, I was way late on the way out here. I was coming down Allegheny River Boulevard. They had a fire like 5 years ago, but they still closed the road. And I grew up in a different country. I'm driving around, I don't know where I am. I said, there's a gas station. Oh my God, that's Salvation. They'll know. Hey, do you know how to get to Oklahoma? No, unfortunately, I'm familiar with the area. I'm sorry. Which I'm not trying to be, you know, God bless everyone, but, you know. I don't know, I'm a man, I'm not supposed to ask for directions anyway. So, and I am John McIntyre, and I'm on Wednesday and Thursday nights on KDKA Radio, so I don't see dead people, thank you. Oh, the crowd goes wild. I don't see dead people, but I do talk to them on the radio. So, briefly, Dr. Wecht, as we know, as you may know, is not only a doctor, but a lawyer, and if my research is correct, an Indian chief. But a lot of people don't know what a great guy he is. He's such a nice guy. Not long ago, he had the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, JFK, seminars. People from all over the world, experts, brilliant people, doctors, forensic experts, detectives, lawyers. At the 40th anniversary, he had our inspector who was trying to justify the single bullet theory. That was hysterical. But anyway, at the end of the 50th anniversary show, I say, Dr. Wecht, what if I did a comedy show, like at night after your big serious seminar? And he was nice enough to approve that ridiculous idea. So it's a horrible rainy night, but he still comes and he brings his colleagues, and I'm coming out as John Kennedy going, what's wrong with you people? You are the original Star Trek nerds. We need another reinvestigation like I need a hole in the head. Right, it's a horrible joke, and yet Dr. Wecht still lets me do events with him. How about that? Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Cyril Wecht. Dr. Wecht, thank you so much. Oh, they're going to shut off the music, yeah. You're not going to let the whole goddamn music play the whole night, are they? So, you know, we've had many of these conversations before, and thank you so much for doing this and being here,
John,
sir.
it's a pleasure, and the first thing is to thank all these wonderful people for coming here. Really, it's very heartwarming. Holiday weekend, I'm sure everybody has plans, but thank you. And some people were here last time, and one lady asked me, when are you going to be here next again? But anyway, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the proprietor of the Oaks here, and John, you, of course, for setting everything up.
Sure. So, before we get into what may have actually happened in November of 1963 in Dallas, Texas, you've made this point many times before. Why is it so important that we get to the truth, if at all possible, this many years later? Some people might say it's ancient history. Why bother to continue to pursue what really happened in Dallas in 1963?
I think before you get to the question of who is responsible for Kennedy's assassination, let's just look at the event itself. I don't believe that it is at all an exaggeration, any kind of a political stretch to say that the assassination of President Kennedy changed the political spectrum in this country and in the world dramatically. Okay? The things that were going on domestically with the South civil rights and voting rights and overall attitude and policies and how Americans viewed each other. I won't digress now. I do want to digress later. And just, for example, think of the political discussion that took place then in the election of 1960 and before, and in the elections that followed, with what is happening now today. And I hope we'll be able to talk about the Ringling Brothers Fire Kelly circumstances. In fact, maybe this is all just a big hoax. Maybe this is all a revival of the big circus. So then, nationally, you had these things of great impact, and it was being played out politically in many ways. Don't forget, at that time, all the Southern senators were Democrats and so on. And then internationally, what was happening in Vietnam, in China, in Russia, our whole foreign policy, and Cuba. So the death of Kennedy changed these things dramatically for then and the future. Now then, you get to the obvious question of the assassination and who was responsible and so on. Because then you have to deal with the question of who wanted, who needed, who felt it was necessary, essential to pursue their own policies to eliminate John Kennedy. Why is it still important? Because it was, and I save these lines always for my closing lines, but your segue is such that I'll use that closing commentary now. You had the overthrow of the government. You had coup d'etat in America. That's what you had, John, this great democracy of ours. To allow that to go unanswered, unaddressed, to let it go unresolved, when you think of the impact that it had on people's lives here and throughout the world, that would be cowardly, morally, ethically, intellectually, pusillanimous. I mean, it would be a shame. I mean, at what point do you say, well, something's past history and you're not going to address it? And those forces, not only in theory, but I think in practice, not exactly the same people, not exactly the same issues, but those forces remain at play today. We're all very sanguine about America, and we pat ourselves on the back, this marvelous country, et cetera, and indeed it is. And there's not one of us, I think, who would rather live anywhere else, or who is at least been unhappy about having been born and raised and growing up, and to have grown up in America. But that is not the same as saying that, we are just a wonderful country, we're a perfect democracy, and we don't have any of these kinds of things happening here. There is an arrogance, a kind of intellectual, super patriotic arrogance that all of us have as Americans because of what a great nation we are, and coming off World War II in particular, all those years when we were unquestionably the greatest power in the world, et cetera, to look down to some extent on other countries, and also to be very quick to criticize things that happen in other nations and to ignore those same kinds of actions in our country. And the authorities still continue to get away with these kinds of things in different ways. Maybe we'll touch upon the death of Justice Scalia and how it was handled, for example. Talk about the death of Nelson Rockefeller in New York and how it was handled. And how the government, can continue to manipulate and handle all of these things. So, it's important because it gets to the essence, I guess, of who we are, and what we're going to be.
And when you say,
so, that's the best I can answer. But it is important, not a matter of I don't think the people who shot the guns are around. We're going to throw them in jail, and if they were around, a big goddamn deal. They could be 85, 95, whatever, put them in jail. That's not the issue. That's not the issue. The issue is the forces behind them, the socio-political philosophies that directed them, and are they still extant? Are they still there for this kind of potential in the future? And now it plays out particularly because where are we to get very serious about what lies ahead in these next several months in the primary, both Republican and Democrat, and then the general election. Who are we? Where are we going? What does the rest of the world think about us? Where's our leadership? So, we'll get into that.
What are we going to do about these millionaires and billionaires?
But when you say it was a coup d'etat, does that mean, and I'm probably oversimplifying it, that despite all the talk of the Russians and the Cubans and the mob, you think it was more perhaps at that time current and or former CIA rogue agents that were responsible?
Yes, the Russians and the Chinese and the Cubans had not a damn thing to do with this. just stop and think politically. Remember, how were they going to benefit from getting rid of John Kennedy? What, there's somebody better for them? John Kennedy was reaching out, trying to warm up, the Cold War. John Kennedy was looking to pull out of Vietnam. Well, how are they going to benefit? John Kennedy was unhappy about the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the attempted invasion of Cuba. So, even just to begin with, who's your substitute? Who's next in line? How are you going to get Lyndon Johnson? If you look at it, put the spectacles of the Russians, the Cubans, and the Chinese on. We want to rather have Lyndon Johnson than John Kennedy. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay, so forget that. The mafia was involved as secondary people to accomplish certain things, of course. Carlos Marcello, who was the #1 mafioso don in America. He was the most powerful. He much more powerful than Lucky Luciano and Sad Trafficante and all of that entire crew. So did they use them? Did they have to employ them for various things? You bet your life, including, of course, one very, very important endeavor, and that was to eliminate Lee Harvey Oswald. Thank you, Jack Ruby. Jacob Rubenstein, 17 years old in Chicago, was already mixed up with the mafia at the periphery, of course. And then down in Dallas, he was one of their boys. He's a relatively small timer, but you know what I mean? In the meantime, he's a restaurateur, he's a pimp, he's a bar owner, he's a police informant, he's smuggling guns into Cuba. As I've said, Damon Runyon on LSD could not have created a character like Jack.
How about Doc Ellis?
Yeah. And with the Warren Commission, they said, Jack Ruby, that Sunday morning, November 24th, he, with his great, wonderful, magnanimous heart of his, went down to Western Union to wire some money to a former stripper. And when he got out, lo and behold, across the street is the back entrance to the Dallas Public Safety Building. Nothing better to do, what the hell? So he just walks down the ramp, and gee, here comes Lee Harvey Oswald. And I can't let that bastard live and go to trial. Think of the psychological, emotional trauma for poor Jacqueline Kennedy and her family, and he decides on the spur of the moment that he's going to kill Jacqueline. That's the Warren Commission.
And he happens to be packing a
It's
rub.
been now shown. This is now a fact that he was let in by a high-ranking police officer through a door. That still doesn't prove that he was let in to assassinate Ruby, but that'll start for openers, no pun intended.
When you were called by the House Assassinations Committee to re-examine this in the late 70s, correct?
In the House Select Committee on Assassinations was established in 1977, bipartisan, and it was established largely through the efforts of the Black Congressional Caucus because of Martin Luther King. So they pushed the Democrats and the Republicans, and they said, okay, we're going to establish the House Select Committee on assassinations to reinvestigate John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And then they appointed various panels. There was, in the field of medicine, pathology and radiology, and then ballistics, and so on down the line, photography, etc. And I was one of 9 members appointed to the pathology panel of that House Select Committee on Assassination.
And among the amazing discoveries, correct me if I'm wrong, you were the one who discovered, hey, wait a minute, the president's brain is missing?
That was way back in 1972.
Oh, I apologize,
That was
really?
6 years earlier. In 1972, I was the first non-government appointed forensic pathologist given access to the JFK autopsy materials in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Very, very briefly, just to show you the way this was all set up. the assassination of November 22nd, 1963. April of 1965, things are beginning to get a little bit hot. People are beginning to raise questions and so on. So they came up with the idea, you know, all of these things belong to Jackie Kennedy. The president's clothing, the gun, the bullet fragments, the x-rays, everything Connolly's belongs to Jacqueline Kennedy, okay? And Jackie Kennedy, she wanted that, you know, like I want with the hole in the head that she referred to. Okay. So why did they do that? So that she could, giving that gift to the federal government, she could stipulate who and when anybody could see it. Let's say you've got this great collection of stamps, or sailboats made out of toothpicks in a glass jar, whatever. You give it to the National Archives and they want it, okay? You might stipulate, I'll give it to you, but on the condition that every fourth Wednesday afternoon it be made available only to this society or this group of people, you know, anything like that. You know, if it's reasonable, and they want it. So they said that these were her private property, her possession, so that she could stipulate that nobody could see these things for 75 years. 75 years. With the exception that after 5 years, that a recognized expert in the field of pathology, the exact quote, recognized expert in the field of pathology with a serious historical purpose could apply. But let's go back now. April '65 is the gift. I'm sorry, that was actually April '65. And then about a year and a half later, in October of '66, two of the pathologists and a third doctor go in to do an inventory on, this is Kennedy's property, okay? They do that inventory. That's 1966. Okay. So 5 years begins to run, that 5-year period that I just referred to. So it comes October of '71, just so happened, fortuitously, in that year, as well as being board certified forensic pathologist and coroner of Allegheny County, I was president of both the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the largest, most prestigious group of forensic scientists in the world, and I was also president of the American College of Legal Medicine. So I applied to go in October. I never heard. The executor of the agreement was Burke Marshall, who had been Deputy Attorney General under Robert Kennedy, and who at that time then, in '71, was a professor of law at Yale University. He's the executor of the agreement. I write to him, no answer. I write a second time, no answer. One day I get a phone call, I don't know, I guess sometime in November, I don't remember exactly when, it's Fred Graham. He identifies himself with the New York Times. I came to know at that time he was one of the #1 reporters for the New York Times. And he introduced himself, and he told me that he had heard I was applying to gain access, and would I mind if he made an inquiry? I said, no, by all means, Mr. Graham, fine. So he called me back 2 or 3 weeks later on and asked me if I'd heard anything, and I told him no. I'll never forget that line. He said, not in an egotistical way, but just, you know, like we would be talking here. He said, I'm going to call. He said, sometimes people respond to the New York Times. Yes, you bet your ass. Sometimes people respond to the New York Times. So, sure enough then, a week or two later, I get a response finally from Professor Burke Marshall. Tells me he's going away now, Christmas holiday. He'll get in touch with me afterwards. And I write again to remind him. And then he's still making me jump over hurdles. He says, tells me I have to come to New Haven to be interviewed by him. Little did he know, that's my second home. And my closest relative, my first cousin, I'm an only child, and he's an only child, and he's a few years younger, and we have a home then in Connecticut, still do. So